Hey, welcome back to another TouchDesigner tutorial. So today I'm going to be showing you these two components. I ended up taking OpenAI's new models for Whisper, which is a model that will do audio to text transcription, and the new ChatGPT API. And I set them up as components in TouchDesigner so that you don't have to install anything. All you need to do is just put in your API key and you can run them. And the other thing I've done is I've actually hooked up the Whisper model to ChatGPT so that you can just use your microphone input and then you can start piping that over to ChatGPT in order to have a conversation. I've also done some experiments with the code that ChatGPT will output and using that within TouchDesigner to, for example, generate a shader on the fly. Let's go ahead and take a quick look at the setup that I have in here, and then I'll go over how to get everything working in your own project. The Whisper component is set up so that all you need to do is take an audio device in and pipe it as the input, and then you can start recording. And the second that you stop recording, I have this current project set up to automatically send that over to the ChatGPT component, and it will read in that message and then automatically generate a response. So let's go ahead and try that out. Generate a Mandelbrot fractal using a GLSL top. All right, this is loading, and let's go ahead and see what it'll output. There we go. So usually ChatGPT will output a message followed by the actual shader code with triple backticks, and then some more example information below. So what I did in this little script up here is I just look for the triple backticks, and then I take that code and I'll just pipe it over to this GLSL text component right here. So if I run this, it'll copy it over, and we can see that we get a red square. Oh, there we go. Okay. So it looks like I need to tweak the center a little bit, and it's only outputting the color in the red channel. So we can actually modify this to make it maybe all white. I'll go in here. Notice that for this final output, it is setting only the red channel here. So I'm going to delete these last two, and I'm going to wrap this in a Vec3. There we go. All right. That way we can always vary the color later. And then here we can see that there's a uniform called center and scale. And so we can play around with the center point to move around the fractal, and then scale should zoom in and out. It kind of feels like it also changes the center a little bit. Definitely some pieces to play around with here. I could also imagine using a setup like this in order to also run different snippets of Python code within TouchDesigner. So to prime this, what I ended up doing is I pass in a table and I give the chat agent a little bit of information around how shaders work in TouchDesigner. So first I tell it that it is actually software running inside TouchDesigner. And then I took the Wikipedia page from TouchDesigner that covers all the different implementations of shaders within that context. And I put in a good chunk of that Wikipedia article. And then I also put in another message showing it just a really simple example of a shader in TouchDesigner. And that way you can prompt it for different outputs, and ideally it'll give you a functional shader within TouchDesigner. The other thing that I wanted to show you is how to create different priming tables for ChatGPT. So this primer messages section right here is just looking for a table from TouchDesigner. And the one thing that you need to do is just make sure to keep the same naming convention and overall structure of this table, and it should work fine. So what you can do, you can place any table, and then the very first row and column needs to be the system. Or you can start with the system if you'd like, but this is like general information around what the assistant is, what the context of it is. And what we can do is we can add another column, and this is going to be the message. So let's say like you are Refik Anadol, the artist. And then maybe we could say you start every tweet with dear friends. And then the other thing you can do is you can add another row, and you can add in an example user message. And then you can add in another row that is a assistant message. And one thing to note as well, like if you need to delete any of the rows and columns here, you can always right click on the number on the far left hand side, and then that allows you to be able to delete that whole row. Try not to have like empty cells. And then what you can do here is now we can actually drag and drop this onto the primer messages, and notice that those get tacked into the very beginning of the message history here. And then now if I clear the chat, those should be the original messages that get tacked into the very top. So we can write a new message now. Let's try it out. Write me a tweet about my new world's first AI generative model. There we go. Dear friends, I'm thrilled to announce the creation of my new world's first AI generative model. All right, yeah, you get the idea. Cool. One thing to note too is that if you get the naming convention wrong here, like let's say I accidentally put in the name users and you tried to generate this, it's a very specific naming convention, but if you do generate it incorrectly, you'll get an error message that looks like this. Users, and like take a moment to like read through whatever the message is. I know the format can look a little funny, but here it says users is not one of system assistant roles, invalid request error. And hopefully that'll help you kind of figure out where that error is happening from. So for both of these components, these are going to be available on my Patreon, and I'll put a link to that in the description. You can download them there. We're going to go ahead and get started by adding in the API key. So I'm going to delete mine after this, but one thing to note is that I actually do have the API key linked between these two components. I bound those parameters together so that it's just shared between them. So in order to get your API key, let's go ahead and head on over to platform.openai sign up. If you don't have an account for OpenAI, go ahead and make one. You're going to need to make sure to have a credit card associated with your account. Otherwise, it is not going to work. So definitely go ahead and start by going over, if you haven't already done this, go ahead and go to manage account, and you're going to need to go to billing. And over here, you should be able to see a little drop down here to link a credit card, and you can add it in there. So the one thing that I really like about the new updates for the ChatGPT and the Whisper model is that they're 1/10 of the price of what they used to be. So I've been sending a lot of requests to it, and I think so far I've spent 29 cents. So we're doing great. Barely any cost. I've been using the language model a lot and the ChatGPT. So the next thing we want to do is generate a API key. So go ahead, and if you click on your personal profile over here in the top right, and then go down to view API keys, you're going to click this button right here that says create new secret key. And then that's going to pop up with a key. Go ahead and copy that and make sure you have access to it. And then you're going to go over to either one of the components, and then you're going to paste it into this API key section, and that'll automatically be shared between both components. Now, again, if you don't have the credit card information put in, you will see an error that'll pop up. Just make sure to read the messages, and I'll show you as well, like if you have the wrong API key or something like that and generate something, it'll pop up with an error message. It'll say, hey, like incorrect API key. Take a moment to, if you do ever run into an error like this, take a moment to read whatever the message is. I know when it's in kind of this JSON format, it can be a little overwhelming to read, but definitely can help. So really quickly, another thing that I did is I set up the Whisper model so that you can actually provide it a file path. So notice right here, I just have a hard-coded path to a file on my computer, And what I can also do here is I can just hit pulse and it'll process that local file. And in that recording, I said that text verbatim. The other things to note here as well is that I included all the different optional parameters that OpenAI includes on their documentation site. So you can play around with the temperature. Honestly, it sounds like OpenAI will like run some optimization to figure out an optimal temperature for the text transcription. So I would recommend keeping it at 0. You can also give it context here in this prompt for the conversation that's happening, and you can also switch the language. And if you want to learn more about the different optional parameters, you can go over here and click the help button, and that will take you over to the OpenAI documentation where you can read a little bit more about those specific calls. So you can see here we have file, model, prompt, and you can just see some more information around those. Same thing as well is true with the ChatGPT model. If we go over to the ChatGPT model, I have all of the different optional parameters here set to their default, but you can also click here on the pulse and then learn more about the actual implementation of it. So I've got this set up right now so that you can include this table for primer messages. If you want to just have a general conversation with ChatGPT, you can always clear the messages, and notice that it keeps this history of messages here. It's actually pulling these from the primer messages, and that's a reference to this table. So if you don't want to have any primer messages, you can just delete the table, and then now you're going to have a blank slate conversation with ChatGPT. Right now it's also set up so that it is getting its message from Whisper, from this little text output right here. You can always just write into this text box as well. By default, I have it set with an expression getting this message. You can always go back to the general constant mode, and you can just write any message that you want in here. So we can say, hello, and generate a response. You can see here that I have the full chat log, so we're able to see the user's message was hello, and the assistant said, hello there, how are you today? And I also just have this text box set up so that it'll output whatever the current message is and show just a little example as well of how to get that into something like a text top so that you can just display the message or display the response that the AI had. The other thing I did for both of these components, you'll notice that I tacked on this status. So these chops will contain any information around whether or not it's currently loading or if there's an error. The one thing that I wanted to show you all how to do is I'm going to rebuild the part of the network that connects the Whisper model to ChatGPT. And my goal in doing that is to show you how to be able to take these components and then extend the functionality. Because ideally, you could take the Whisper model and then plug it into something else. Maybe you want to hook it up to the Stable Diffusion component. So you could just use speech to text and then have that start processing an image to generate. Or you could take the Whisper model, send it to ChatGPT, have ChatGPT generate a potential prompt for an image, and then send that to Stable Diffusion. Hopefully you can take this in many, many different directions as well. Let's go ahead and build that part of the network from scratch. I'm going to delete this chop execute, and I'm going to put this, notice that we had the ChatGPT message has no reference right now. So that's perfect. So what do we want to do? We want to be able to take the message right here that's going to get transcribed. We want to be able to set that as the message for ChatGPT. And then once we know that that message has been generated, we want to then programmatically click this generate response button. So let's go ahead and start by creating a reference to this message so that we can just get the output of it. If we open up the parameters here, we can switch this into a, you already see, we can switch this into a reference mode, and we can start writing a Python expression here. And the way that we can get access to the text out of any text dat is to first get a reference to the operator. So we're going to get OP, it's called message. And this is true for any text dat. We can just get .text, and there we go. Notice that we're getting the message that's written here now. Okay, perfect. So the next part that we want to do is figure out when this component is finished loading, we want it to programmatically trigger this generate response button. Well, the first thing we need to figure out is how to use the different callback functions in TouchDesigner from a chop. So I'm going to show you a separate example real quick. We're going to look at a chop execute. And what I want to do is hook it up to just a constant and show you how that works. So I want to be able to just output a message to the Python console here in TouchDesigner anytime that this value changes. So I'm going to take this chop and I'm going to drag it onto the chop execute. And now this chop execute can listen to changes here. And what this does is it gives us a bunch of little Python helper functions that we can use depending on what happens in this chop. So by default, this helper function value change is turned on. So anytime that the value changes here, this lowest function right here on value change is going to run, and we can run whatever operation we want. So if I go in here, I can print the value, and notice that we get that as an input. We get the channel, the sample index value, and the previous value. So I'm just going to print the value, and I'm going to hit Option T. I'm on Mac, and that will open up this console. Now what I can do is go ahead and start to change this value. Perfect. We get that output to the console. So in our case, we want to be able to run a Python command on a very specific event. And that is when the loading chop goes from on to off. That way we'll know that it's finished loading. And once that happens, then we'll write a little Python snippet of code to pulse this generate response button. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to delete the constant and that chop execute. And what we're going to do is we're going to attach a chop execute to the loading null. There we go. Notice here in the chops, it's referencing null1, which has this loading. So we want to actually activate the it's going to be loading and then it's going to be done loading. So it's going to be on and then it's going to turn off. So we're going to turn this event listener on, and we're going to turn off the value change function. So we can delete everything else. We don't actually need any of that. We just need the on to off. And let's go ahead and we can just print done loading. When that happens, I'm going to open up that console again, and I'm going to just pulse this little transcribe file. One thing to note is that you're not going to have this audio file, so make sure you can either just record the audio for a second and then use that. So it printed done loading. That's awesome. Now let's go ahead and figure out how to pulse the ChatGPT button right here. What I'd like to do is kind of run things in isolation. So now that we know that we have our event listener set up, let's go ahead and separately just place down a text stat, and let's figure out how we can run a snippet of Python code to pulse this button. One thing that I like doing to get a reference to these is to just place down a constant chop, and then go ahead and click on the ChatGPT component. And if you go over to the text that's next to the pulse button, if you click and drag, notice that we get this little arrow. I can hover over the constant, go over to this little numeric area right here, drop it, paste it as a reference. Okay, so now we have the Python expression that gives us a reference to that button. And take a look at this snippet right here. I'm going to copy it and paste it into this text dat right here. But I think, let's go ahead and read through this. So we're getting a reference to the operator ChatGPT, and then we're getting the parameter generate response. So one thing that's cool about this is that this format right here will work to get a reference to any of these as well. So you can always figure out what the name of the parameter is by clicking on the name, and then you'll see the actual programmatic naming underneath it. So for any of these parameters, if it is capitalized and has spaces, it'll be named with capital frequency, lowercase, penalty. So that's definitely helpful to know. The way that we can actually simulate a click on this button is by calling .pulse. with parentheses on it. And then we can run this script by right-clicking on this, and then you can either hit run, and also notice that you can hit Command R. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to hit Command R, and that will, you need to be selected on it, and then you need to hit Command R, and then you'll see it's loading. Okay, great. So let's go ahead and take this Python snippet, and now that we know that works, I'm going to copy that snippet of code. I'm going to delete the constant and the text, and then we're going to go over to the chop execute, and instead of printing, we're going to paste that line of code in so that once it's finished loading, it's going to pulse this button to generate the text. So this should work. We can go ahead, we can record new audio, and this should automatically send it to ChatGPT. Let's see. There we go. That gets sent. It automatically triggered it. It seems like ChatGPT doesn't really know how to respond to that necessarily, but that's totally fine. Great. So hopefully this will give you a sense of how you can kind of extend some of this functionality. Thanks again for following along. I'm really excited to see what you'll make using these two new components. And let me know what you're working on. I'd be super excited to see the different projects that you're creating with things like this. If you like this type of content, consider giving the video a like and subscribe. Thanks again. I look forward to seeing you in the next one.